So we need
James
Freeman, please, to
join.
come here. And I think now the really deep discussions will start.
Thank you. Thank you, James. Thank you for coming. We need your inputs. We are very happy and proud to have you here today. We really want to discuss with you about the real-world data that we have in this part of the Atlantic and the other side that you represent today. The pointer? No, it's here. As you are the leader of the National Cardiovascular Data Registry, we want you to introduce this registry, the goals, the aims, and the main results that you have.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. It's a real honor to be at this conference and to be with this esteemed group of investigators and clinicians. I'm Jim Freeman. I lead the program in cardiac electrophysiology at Yale, and then I direct the Analytics Center for the National U.S. Left Atrial Appendage Occlusion Registry. So I was told I have a couple extra minutes, so I'm going to try and fit in a lot. We've have a fairly substantial body of work, and I just want to try and cover some of that. So the NCDR LAO registry was launched by the American College of Cardiology. It's a U.S. national registry, and it was launched in January 2016. In February of 2016, it was designated as the U.S. Medicare coverage decision, so the registry for that coverage decision. So if someone is getting their procedure and the reimburser in the United States is Medicare, they have to be included in the registry. And the vast majority of sites include all of their patients. So we think we have about 98% capture of all procedures performed in the United States. In terms of data collection, we collect data at implant, 45 days, 6 months, 1 year, and 2 years. So active follow-up through 2 years. The follow-up is quite good. By the time we get to 2 years, we're down to about 70% complete follow-up, but that's pretty impressive actually for a registry. There's linkage to Medicare data for 5-year follow-up, so I'll show a study or two where we have full data out to 5 years. We created an automatic and manual adjudication process, so we try and adjudicate this data and make sure that it is accurate, and validated that and published that. We actually think this is a paradigm that should be used across large registries and even trials in the future at greatly reduced costs, and is well validated for adjudicating our major adverse events. There's audits of 5% of sites annually, and that's to confirm that the data is accurate and complete, and very good agreement with source documentation. And then, of course, the data is used for science through a standard process. So this is actually, I was just trying to update my slides with data I got today, but couldn't put them in just in time. But we are over 600,000 procedures in the registry at this point in the U.S., and over 3,800 sites, or rather implanters with over 920 sites in the U.S. So really broadly generalizable, obviously, and really representative of everything that's happening in the U.S. The registry serves a number of regulatory functions. So obviously I talked about the CMS coverage decision and the fact that we have about 98% capture of cases performed in the US. It also serves as the formal FDA post-market surveillance study for approved devices in the US. So the data is pushed out to Boston Scientific in a registry called the SURPASS registry, which is just a sub-registry of the LAAO registry, and Abbott, that's called Emerge LAAA. And that's for 2 years after a device is released or there's a major device iteration. So for example, with the first generation Watchman, that was pushed out, and then when they released the Watchman Flex, that was also pushed out to Boston. They convene steering committees that work with industry analytic teams to perform research and answer FDA-related safety and effectiveness queries, as well as strategic questions for the companies. So what's our research output been today? I just kind of tallied this up. This is the stuff I've been involved in. There may have been a couple papers that I wasn't involved in, but 37 publications to date since 2020. This is funded through a number of mechanisms, directly funded through a competitive process at the ACC NCDR. So there's an annual process where anyone can submit, and you don't even have to be a US citizen. So anyone can submit to this competitive process annually. In February, our group obtained funding from the NIH in the United States to answer a number of questions, and that was a really successful effort. And then industry funding to NCDR to answer strategic questions. So occasionally, even outside of SURPASS, if they want to do things, but they don't have the full set of data that they need in SURPASS or in eMERGE LAA, industry will come to us and ask us to do some science with them. And then, as I say, there's funds paid to the NCDR for the SURPASS and eMERGE LAA efforts. So I'm just going to highlight who's in the registry, what we've seen to date. This is actually older data from early in the registry experience, but it's quite representative of what we've seen. So the average age early in the experience was 76. We're now up to about 78. And about 40% women in the US and about 90% white and European, although actually that has pushed down over time and we've started to see more underrepresented minorities. 26% of patients have a prior history of ischemic stroke in the US. 37% have a history of prior congestive heart failure. 37% with diabetes, over 92% with hypertension, intracranial bleeding in 11%, and then prior clinically relevant bleeding in about 70%. So I think this data shows these are sicker, older patients, and the vast majority of them in the US anyway, early in the experience, had prior clinically relevant bleeding. That has drifted down a little bit over time as we see a little bit more patient preference, but overall it's held in the mid to high 60s. Mean CHA2DS2 VAS score in the US is about 4.6. It's actually pushed up to about 4.8 and substantially higher risk than in the prior trials upon which the device was approved. And then the has blood score about 3, and that's remained very steady over time. Procedural success in the registry, 98%, very similar to what we've seen in the clinical trials. And I think I'm going to highlight that a bunch of the data that we've seen has been very consistent with what we've seen in the trials because I think that's important for giving face validity to the data. And I just also want to recognize that this is observational data. There are limitations to that. We understand that better than anyone. We try to do science that's appropriate to observational data and then leave certain key questions to randomized trial data. So I'm just going to run through very quickly some of our data research. Do I have a little extra time, more than 10 minutes, to talk today, Philippe? Is that okay? Is that okay? Okay. So we did this natural experiment analysis. We really wanted to understand how much better is the Watchman Flex device than the previous 2.5 device. So what we did is right after the transition, in the US, you had to take your old devices off your shelf and when you got the new devices. And so if a site had done 37 Watchman Flex procedures, we looked at the prior 37 2.5 procedures, and so a site basically was compared to itself. We ended up with 27,000 people in each arm of the study, and you can see that the baseline characteristics were almost perfectly matched using this study design. So this is an example of an interesting observational study design, and the patients were quite similar. So what we see is that the major adverse event rate when we went to Flex dropped by almost half. The rates of catastrophic adverse events like death and device embolization decreased from 1 in 500 to 1 in 1,000. And then most importantly, we see this marked drop in pericardial effusion requiring intervention from 1.2% to 0.4%. So, and that resulted in marked reduction in major bleeding. So this is an example of some data that we did quite early on. We have looked at the real-world experience with Amulet as well, and it's just to say that we've shown very similar effectiveness. I think the one thing that we've have shown consistently with Amulet is this rate of pericardial effusion requiring intervention being a bit higher, and I've seen the second-generation device. I'm very excited for that, and I think we'll largely address that problem just as the iteration with Watchman addressed the issue of pericardial effusion there. This is one-year data looking at rates of ischemic stroke, and we've shown very consistently rates of ischemic stroke in this population, again with CHA2DS2 VAS score of 4.6 to 4.8, of about 1.5%, and that has been extremely consistent with what's been seen in clinical trials. This is an example of work that we did where we used the Medicare linkage to get long-term follow-up, so 4 to 5 year follow-up. Here you can see rates of stroke after left atrial appendage occlusion accounting for competing risk of death, and you can see all stroke, so ischemic stroke about 1.5%, all stroke about 1.8%. And whether we use Medicare data or the active follow-up, we saw very similar numbers, which is very reassuring again. And I think this answered a really important question around the durability of left atrial appendage closure for stroke prevention over time. Okay, so we knew that the trials went out. At that time, we didn't have 3 to 5 year data from Champion and Catalyst. And so for us, this was important to show that there's a durability of the impact. We also have shown this, and I think this is a really important slide. About 8.5% of people die every year after this procedure. And so this is a clarion call, and I think a really important slide for us in our discussion today as we're going to try and achieve consensus about who should be getting this procedure. We're not doing a great job universally in finding people who aren't going to die. These people are not dying of cardiovascular causes, but they're dying of all-cause mortality, and we need to be doing a better job of selecting people that are not at risk of dying soon. I'm really proud of some work that we've done looking at post-procedural antithrombotics. I think this is a really, really important topic. I talk about this whenever I get a microphone. I think this is a huge opportunity to try and mitigate bleeding risk after this procedure, which continues to be a problem in the field, in my opinion. So we've demonstrated several times, and this is also an interesting thing to state in a European community, because I think DAPT is still very commonly used after left atrial appendage closure here, but we've published several times now that using anticoagulation alone without aspirin is markedly lower risk than anticoagulation plus aspirin, and is lower risk than DAPT for bleeding just in the first 6 weeks. So a decrease of about 1.5% to 2% in the first 6 weeks alone after the procedure. There are some differences in people that get this, so you have to be a little careful about this with observational data. It's been a pretty consistent finding, and then has subsequently, of course, been demonstrated in trial data. We published 2 papers in JACC with both iterations of the Watchman device on this. We looked at residual leak. And we did some of the early work demonstrating that even small leaks are associated with an increased risk of thromboembolic event, and I think something we'll be talking about here. So I think meta-analytic data from the PROTECT and PREVAIL trials showed a similar finding, and then subsequent studies have confirmed that finding. We've got a suite of studies that we're planning looking at concomitant AF ablation and left atrial appendage occlusion. This is increasingly very common in the United States. We do have data from OPTION, but there's a dearth of data, so we're looking at trying to publish about 8 studies in the next few years in this space, and we got a large grant to do that work. So in terms of future directions, I think DRT incidence, outcomes, and predictors, we've got a study that we're working on right now. Historically, we've been a little limited in the registry because not everyone does universal late imaging, but we found 30 sites that do universal late imaging and allowed us to really assess when DRT is occurring. So we're going to define high-risk populations and try and understand who has DRT. Our hope out of this science is to define high-risk populations who need more intensive antithrombotics after the procedure and who should have universal late imaging to help us better detect DRT and or prevent it in high-risk patients. We're going to look at the growth of concomitant sequential AF ablation and left atrial appendage occlusion, as I said, with a suite of studies over a number of years. We need to continue to look at leak incidence, outcomes, and predictors. New device performance after commercial release, because we are still the registry of choice for this, we will continue to serve as the FDA post-market surveillance study for new devices, so that'll be great as we start to see new devices come onto market. Post-procedural antithrombotics, optimization and customization of this remains a really important topic in my opinion. As I said, we'll look at discharge regimes and duration, how that evolves over time. It's really changed over the last several years, and we hope it will continue to change. And then if anyone is interested in trying to do a trial looking at aspirin discontinuation for those without vascular indications at 1 year, I'm very interested in this topic. Aspirin puts people at higher risk for bleeding, and I think is something that we're really interested in trying to do. We're thinking about trying to do it as a cluster randomized trial embedded in the registry. And then we have a lot of interest in ICE versus TE. We're seeing growth in the use of ICE-only procedures, particularly with concomitant procedures in the US. So in conclusion, the NCDR LAO Registry is a US national registry with high procedural capture, broad generalizability, and very good follow-up. It serves a number of important regulatory functions in the U.S. There's been substantial research output today, a potential to continue to answer foundational questions, and then we'll monitor the safety and effectiveness of new devices after commercial release. So that was a whirlwind. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much, Jim. I don't know if there's a hot question or we have time for question at the end of the session. So maybe Erik, you can join the podium, because the idea for this second presentation is that you guys together, you define if there's some need and goals for US and European collaboration. We definitely need some kind of global forum discussion about this. And as you mentioned, Jim, there's still some unanswered questions. It's about what is the best imaging technique to drive the procedure. Do we really need to follow and to continue antithrombotic therapy beyond 1 year, for example? There's a lot of questions, and we need data for that. I mean, we cannot just say, okay, that's okay, my patient is okay, I will remove everything. We don't have this data, so we need data. That's why we're here. And Erik, please, go ahead.
Thank you very much. First of all, James, where are you? There, okay. We are completely impressed by this NCDR registry. Having almost now 500,000 patients enrolled into the registry, having a coverage of almost 100%, having all those important publications, I think it's completely amazing and very, very impressive. And when we started this club back in 2024, it was clear for us we must build something like the NCDR registry here in Europe. We need to see if we here in Europe are doing good and safe LAAC. We need to follow patients' outcomes. So we had two aims actually from the beginning when we formed the club. One was to initiate and try to build this registry, and the other one was also to come up with a new classification for LAAC, more implanter-friendly. And the last thing, we have built the ELAACC score, and we also did a reasonable good start building a European registry. From the beginning, we actually considered requiring, if you wanted to be a member of this club, you should also have a center that reported all your cases into the registry. We have 20 centers now that has the frame and the database, but not all are reporting cases. So at the moment we have about 1,200 cases entered into the database, and we have about 20 centers that have the frame. They are not all active. But also in order to have the discussion with James representing the NCDR, I would just here try to demonstrate for you the construction and how the database, the ELAACC Research Registry works. So the platform here is the REDCap platform, which is very nice because it allows you, all academic institutions can get access to REDCap totally for free, and it allows you completely to build up and structure your database as you want to structure it. And we did that, and in the beginning we also considered should we have one single server for all the data, and that led to some issues around in the different countries. So it ended up that each country actually has their own server for communicating with REDCap. And we are using completely the same database, and the system allows us to share data across countries and centers in specific projects. But I cannot go in to the database, for instance, and see Barcelona data, etc. We have to define specific projects and then merge the data. So the structure of the database, we have demographics, we have pre-procedural imaging, we have the procedural data itself, and then we have early follow-up and late follow-up, and we have clinical outcomes. And just shortly to demonstrate for you how it works. So now we are into the demographics, and we have country of institution, we have the institution, we have the institutional patient number. This is just a demo patient entered here. So the LAAC was done today. It's a male. Date of birth, January 1950. It automatically generates the age, height, weight. We have the parameters for the CHA2DS2-VASc score here. If you click, it will automatically update the CHA2DS2-VASc score, similar for the HASPET score. We have information about pre-procedural echo with ejection fraction. We have renal function, and we have the indications for LAAC here, urinary tract bleeding. We have the type of AF, if there's a hypercoagulation state or disorder or not, information about presence of valvular disease or prior surgical or transcatheter valve therapies. What was actually the antithrombotic therapy at admission? And you can always rapidly monitor whether your charts here are completed or not. So the next step here in entering into the database is about imaging, about pre-procedural imaging. And that's where I think there's a difference between the NCDR and the European registry, because we have data both on pre-procedural and post-procedural imaging. So it was performed, yes, it was cardiac CT. You can also click TE, and you can go in and click which kind of TE was used, 3D, etc. Let's stay at cardiac CT. We can enter the date for the pre-procedural CT, and we can enter all our measurements about the landing zone, perimeter, and area derived is calculated automatically. And then we also have the systematic anatomical approach, which is the basis for the ELAACC classification. We look at entrance to the appendage with the osteal characteristics. Then we look at the landing zone. Here we have a low ostium take-up. We have a proximal lobe at the landing zone area. We can look at the main axis for the LAA. Maybe it can be pronounced anterior. And here also the overall anatomy, it's an early sharp bend here. So we have all those. Also contractility can be entered here. So we have this systematic anatomical approach for all the patients. So I'll just go back here, just 1 second here. This one. It should be online, the database, unless it coupled me off. You need to press down, no? Select the patient, you know. Yeah, but I'm just searching for the patient that I entered. Yeah, but just yeah. Here, yeah. Okay, we're back again. So, about the procedure itself, technical success, yes. Note, this was an uncomplicated procedure, fluoroscopy time, contrast use, procedure time, type of device, what size of the device, device diameter after implant, degree of device compression, if you had recaptures or not, how many devices were used, which kind of intraprocedural imaging was used. Here it was ICE. You have a lot of options here. It was 3D ICE. We had the patient just in local anesthesia, no PDLs at finalizing the procedure. It was not a combined procedure, no thrombus during the procedure, LA pressure, date of discharge, and also information about post-procedural antithrombotic therapy for this patient, aspirin, planned for lifelong, and no procedural complications. Okay, and now this was the procedure itself, and then we have similar pages for follow-up of the patient. This is early follow-up imaging within the interval 30 to 120 days, and we have follow-up imaging, yes, and primary modality used was cardiac CT. You can enter details about the data, etc. If we found a PDL, you can enter details about the PDL, the location, hyperattenuated thickening, etc. If you go for further interventions like leak closure, or you just go for some other solution, and in that way you can really characterize also the actions related to some of the complications here. And same again, you have an option for some patients. We go for also later imaging, and we can insert similar data points later on. And also, most importantly, let's see here, we can go to clinical outcomes, and for every patient that come in with an event, or if we do research, we can go back and enter all the relevant hard clinical endpoints like death, ischemic stroke, hemorrhagic stroke, etc. And then also really follow whether we have had a beneficial course or we had complications, leaks, and heart events and things like that. So that is the structure of the database. So of course, with only it is now 1,200 patients, we have to be very, very humble and modest, but the idea, it's not completely the same, and I think the value of this registry is that we have a lot of detailed information about imaging, about the anatomy before the procedure, and also actually the whole follow-up data capture here is also very detailed. So that can be probably a contribution, and let's imagine things like period device leaks. If we want to try to link that to the pre-procedural anatomy, for example, that will be possible with the information in this database. So I hope there can be options in the future where we can collaborate. But I think the most important thing right now is that we realize, and all of us in the room here appreciate the importance of having a European registry, so we have really this framework similar to what you have. So
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jens Erik. Stay on the podium for the discussion. So Jim, now it's time to discuss together. What do you foresee as a collaboration or point? You mentioned very long-term treatment. Jens Erik mentioned PDL. It's true we have less patients, but we have some favorable data that to show like imaging and everything. So we can help as a mechanistic insight, for example, for PDL, and you have the numbers for the clinical outcome, something like that. I don't know. I give you the mic and let us know.
Perfect. So congratulations, really a remarkable effort, and I think particularly to have we've done a lot of homegrown efforts like this without substantial external funding, and it's really a remarkable achievement. So listen, I think the data are highly complementary. All data is complementary in my opinion. And I couldn't agree more that we have a dearth of data on pre-procedural imaging, so that's a huge contribution to the literature. I'm wondering too whether there's an opportunity to have a sub-registry of leak closure procedures. There's a real, I don't know, there's a cottage industry in the United States right now around leak closure, when it's being done, who it's being done in, what the acute outcomes are, and then long-term outcomes. Do they actually drive down rates of stroke? It's a really foundational question because we know that even in Champion, I think it was close to 20%. I thought that number had been drifting down to, under 15%. So just like in the EP space, we have a whole industry that's been created around getting devices out once we put them in with extraction. I think similarly, there's likely to be a whole space around leak closure as we start to understand increasingly the thromboembolic risk associated particularly with larger leaks. But I think even with smaller leaks, if we get really good at it, and or if there are devices that are developed and for our industry partners, I think there probably is room for development of devices to close leaks. Then we'll be needing data on that. So I think that's a huge opportunity. And I think one of the other wonderful things about this effort that you have here in Europe is that you can be nimble. I think we have a larger bureaucracy. There's whole committee meetings that have to go every time we want to add a data element to our registry. And there's substantial costs involved, so that's often a 6 to 12 month process if we want to iterate on the registry, and so you can iterate pretty quickly, which is pretty remarkable and exciting. And then I'll go home from this. I'd love to get the data collection form if I can, or access to it, to understand exactly what you have for data and do a lot of thinking about how we can collaborate and what we can work on and what you may be able to add to this space. I also, there are some really different practices here in Europe than in the United States. Let's start with the fact that about 2/3 of your implanters, I think, are interventional cardiologists, whereas in the United States, it's 2/3 EP. As you heard earlier, increasingly concomitant procedures are becoming very common in the US, so I'm not sure that's as much the case with an interventional cardiology-led community here in Europe. And there may be pros and cons to both of those things. We're going to study a lot the concomitant space, but early data looks encouraging, but we have some other data that we're looking at, and there may be challenges or pitfalls. And then the use of post-procedural antithrombotics with DAPT being more dominant in Europe. I think it's really important to have registry data on that. Our registry data, where DAPT is used less commonly, would suggest that DAPT's associated with higher rates of bleeding, and there's a signal towards increased risk of thromboembolic events, including DRT. But there is selection bias there because the DAPT patients we know are a little bit higher risk. And so it would be really helpful to have that data from Europe, where it's the dominant thing, and it's not something that people are doing only in subselected folks that are higher risk. I think a tremendous number of opportunities to collaborate and continue to do things. What has been the scientific output to date? Are you still in the early stages of data collection, or?
We are still in the early stages. One of the first projects was to try to look at the reproducibility of the ELAACC score and the whole anatomical classification system. So that project is very far. And we have also tried to address what can the ELAACC score really predict and what can it not predict. So there will be later on the meeting presentation of some of the data there. So it's still quite early. I think also regarding, you mentioned the post-procedural medication, one difference between Europe and US is also that we actually have quite a lot of centers and countries using only single antiplatelet therapy, aspirin. And of course, there's also a selection thing into this, but many centers had this strategy because it's almost all the time very high-risk bleeders, patients with a bleeding history, to go from the beginning very minimalistic. So I think if we collect it in Europe, we have a huge number of patients that are treated post-procedural only with aspirin in a low dose. And we actually also have centers that do appendage closures and leave the patient completely without any antithrombotic treatment. So I think that will also be very interesting data to look closer at.
Yeah, and just one word of, I guess, advice is there was a substantial delay from the inception of the LAO registry to the first publication. And I mean, if you're at 1,000 patients, write the initial paper just with who's in the registry, what you have, describing the registry to kind of get exposure out there. Because there was a bit of a delay, and it was actually one of the reasons that I got involved is because I sort of stepped in to help get the publication process going in 2020. But it was, I mean, 4 years is too long. Like that's not appropriate. You know, when people are paying a lot of money to be in these registries and whatnot, they want to see scientific output. And so we very quickly accelerated the scientific output after that, and I think you're there. So I would encourage you to publish that first paper.
And of course, one of the challenges we have, it requires work to run databases like this, and at the moment it's totally voluntarily. We don't have any economical support at all for this. It could be nice to have a group that could really 100% of their time take care of the database, and I know with the NCDR, you also have monitoring, actually. You have spot monitoring of what are centers really reporting. One fantastic thing with your database is that you have the requirement, you have to report if you want to get reimbursement. And we don't have the similar thing here, so we don't have 100%, of course, reporting of cases. So until now, it's centers that are active and interested in the LAAC field, but we should find a way to, convince centers that this is really the way to go to report to this. And I think it's very, very helpful also for the institution, each institution, to look at their own data and be able all the time to compare with other centers and do we do it good enough? Is there something we should change? Is it a completely different patient profile we are treating in my institution? And so there's a lot of benefit for each center also keeping the database.
You know, I couldn't agree more. So we actually, I'm very sympathetic to this. So we have the reimbursement requirement for left atrial appendage occlusion, but we have a similar registry for AFib ablation, and that's entirely voluntary. So the way we've gotten in the U.S. anyway is that hospitals like to publish their quality metrics to be able to compete against other hospitals in the U.S. And so that's been motivational. But for the AFib ablation registry, we have about 165, depending on when in the year and what year you're looking at, 165 to 180 sites, which is probably only about a 10% sample of sites in the U.S. It's still obviously an enormous number of patients and sites, but smaller, and that comes through our ability to allow hospitals to get their data back and then publish it nationally for kind of in a competitive landscape in the U.S. So it's something to think about, I suppose. And we benchmark the data so that they can, with face validity, say they know where they stand relative to the national data and whatnot. So that, I think, has been very helpful for sites and is why voluntary work still happens.
Yeah. Okay.
In terms of 2 years follow-up, what do you have as a data? You have like imaging follow-up also at 2 years, or is it only clinical follow-up?
Yeah, so it's a registry. So in the U.S., we have imaging. It's very commonly performed around the 6-week mark, which is consistent with the original recommendations, 6 to 12 weeks, I would say. Imaging after that is really rare, which is why our DRT study, for years, Vivek Reddy's been coming to me like, Jim, why haven't you published on DRT yet? And the problem was we couldn't say with any face validity that we could capture late DRT. We found 30 sites that routinely do late imaging on all their patients, And so then we are publishing on that subset of folks. We're working on that paper as we speak. But really what we have then is not late imaging because it's not mandated in the US and sites just don't do it. I think it's a problem. So if you have, that would be another thing is I think if you can institute, and we've tried to do the same in the AFib ablation registry, find a coalition of the willing that are willing to do, for example, late imaging. That would be a huge contribution to the field because you could look at, do leaks close up? Do they get bigger over time? And the DRT problem over time, because we know a lot of DRTs occur late. So if you can have not just data collection, but you can protocolize post-procedural assessment and imaging, that could be really valuable. And this could be like the imaging registry of the world. So I think that's a great idea. But yeah, we have 2-year active follow-up of clinical events. Again, by the time we get to 2 years, about 70% of sites have follow-up. But we have the Medicare linkage has allowed us for at least heart events. So stroke is very well validated in Medicare data. It's actually excellent stroke capture. Death is near perfect. And then bleeding we've actually published on as well. And we have, for some sites, also medication data. And we're just working on that. That data is a little less clean. But so we have that out to 5 years with Medicare follow-up. And that was that data that I showed, showing the very steady rates of stroke and death, which I think is super powerful and important to show there's durable effects, but also the death phenomenon continues. So.
Just a practical question also. I've seen you probably have 20 pages or something when you have to report to NCDR.
Yeah.
So is it the implant itself
No.
that, and who fills out actually the NCDR forms?
Yeah, so the reason that we have, the CMS mandate is really important because sites, I mean, to be honest, don't always love having to do this. They have to pay to participate in the registry. They're mandated to participate in the registry, and it's time consuming. So most hospitals will have data abstractors. So historically, they're non-clinician data abstractors. Nowadays, actually, it's increasingly being done by these third-party vendors that can scan the electronic medical record and scrape the data off that way, and then they do some active sort of querying of the data sets. But and the HRS in the United States is trying to get an AFib ablation registry going where it's all entirely passive using third-party vendors to scrape the data off EHR. That's not been well validated. So we'll have to see how that effort goes, and it's still a developing effort. But yeah, I think there are vendors that can try and pull things off depending upon what electronic medical record you have, and then you have to do some manual entry. But yeah, it's not. We don't have the clinicians entering the data in general.
Okay.
Yeah. So I have a question and a comment. Sorry.
Yes,
yeah,
hi.
Ashan from UK.
Yeah, hi.
So last 2 years, similar to the US, we have the National Audit Reporting System called NICO, which capture PCI data, TAVI data, and last 2 years we started collecting the LAO data. So it is again, we have a capture about 80% capture rate because it's kind of mandatory. So the European one, Jens, Erik, is it in addition to your national registries, or the one, or is it every country might have a national registry for LAO? Or?
No, not at all.
Okay.
Few countries have a national registry, so...
Okay. So what I'm thinking is, I mean, for UK, I think if we can have the same variables that you're collecting, it might be very much easier to amalgamate, and there are a lot of governance issues when I try to start in my institution, but a way forward could be, what I would try is when you agree on the variables, I could try to persuade the committee to add all those variables into our registry, and then maybe export that kind of a system if we can't get into the red NAP system. But compared to US, we have very small numbers of LAOs, so definitely contributing to a registry is the way forward, because we won't be able to publish any academic useful data using a very small numbers at the moment.
No, I think that's very, very important that you don't do a double registry. That will be too much work. So, of course, we'll have to find a solution. And I think the REDCap database is very friendly to import different formats. And we do also have some technical people that can do these things and help to do that. And even though you don't have all the, parameters, we would be very happy to have the UK data within this framework. I mean, that would be very valuable as well. I think we have a wish list for also what we can do with the registry. So that's you, Xavier, that are going to present that.
Thanks, Erik. And thank you for the registry, because actually the registry comes from Arus, from Jens Erik, Anders Kramer, and Casper and the rest of guys. So this needs to be acknowledged. It was born there. So basically, well, I was supposed to talk about the trials I would like to see published related to the ELAACC registry. So then, since we had the pleasure to have Professor Freeman here, and then we went back to the INCDR Registry and then tried to learn a little bit about them. Of course, it's comparing a giant with a newborn, and we are the newborn, but as newborns, we can grow, we can change, we can adapt, and we can learn from giants, from the strength, and also, I guess that I would like to ask you from the weakness as well, if you would change something, no? We can discuss about that. So we have the opportunity to change at this right moment, because we're still small. The other thing I would like just to tell you is that I'm not going to talk about the current status, how to engage, how to do it, and go deep into the just the inclusion of every country, because there's going to be a dedicated session at the end of the meeting. You have like 1,200, but in Spain there are like 1,000 more, and in other countries there are more. So so far we are like probably around like just almost 3,000. So I mean, we have like some power, and that's it. Of course, the problem is that we are not funded. I think that, and Philippe and the rest, we should consider just to be funded, because one of the issues that people tell me, it's that sometimes they struggle in trying to implement the blueprint into the system, try to implement REDCap into their systems, and of course the fact that the NCDR is audited, I mean, it's of course a plus. I don't know if at some point we will be able to do that, but so far, so what I did is just type in PubMed, and then you say that it was 37, now it's 38. So, and you can see here in PubMed from 2020, 2026, the rate of publication. So it has been, like high since 2022. And this is the last publication. The thing that it's nice in the method section, they always, just acknowledge where the information comes from, NCDR, and of course, the number of patients and all this information. This is, I guess, the way that we should just proceed in that sense. And also, the impact factor of these publications, it's really high. It's, JACS, it's JAMA Cardiology, it's Circulation Cardiovascular Intervention, JACS CIs, and actually, you already show, but I try just to, from these 32 publications, try to see what were the topics of publication. And in 3 publications, you talk about generic, the first one, and then, like some, discussion about, the therapy itself. Then you also have 4 papers talking about demographics, gender, frailty, and some other, like just determinants of the population. Then also you analyze LAO in specific settings, intracranial bleeding, GI bleeding, and chronic kidney disease. 5 papers on LAO and imaging, like COE, eyes, and all this. 4 on antithrombotic therapy post-LAO. 2 assessing the long-term outcomes after LAO, and you were born in 2020. So specific device analysis comparing Watchman Flex and with Watchman 2.5 or Watchman with AMOLED 7. So that was probably the most, I would say, published topic or analyzed topic. Procedural analysis, more like, I would say, like technical stuff too. And then, complications, intra and post, like DRTs, leaks, embolization, all these 4. And concomitant intervention, I guess that now it's going to grow, so far with EP1. And that's your impact, okay? So 12 JACC CIs, 8 JACC clinical electrophysiology, 5 JACC, just in the general, 5 circulation cardiovascular intervention, 1 JAMA cardiology, and 7 other, publications. So congratulations. I mean, I think that it's the way for us just to follow. Of course, we're small, but I guess that we have, a lot of opportunities. So then, I will ask, all the audience at the end, what they like just to have published with the ELAACC Registry. But I think, as you said, I don't know, maybe we don't need to wait until having, 10,000 patients, but maybe we should just first present, the registry into, the public, to know that we exist, and to know that maybe we can get some help, from, funding and audition and all this. I think that that's probably the most important publication. And then I pose, some ideas. The other thing that probably we have the strength to publish very long-term data, because since we started the therapy more than 15 years ago, I would say like maybe more than even that. So we can publish a lot, on data and beyond the 10 years. So I think that we have an opportunity here as well. Of course, DRT and PDL analysis, as James showed, we're going to have a lot of information about, specific information about DRTs and PDLs. You didn't open the window of DRT, but the DRT, you can also define the DRT. It's not yes or no. It's DRT, and then you can see exactly what's a DRT, and that's like really good because we will have this information, and of course then we can analyze risk factors, management outcomes. Antithrombotic strategies, we will have everything, even like patients with prothrombotic status, we also capturing this information, and of course, like the things that we're going to talk today, so patient profiles associated with a higher clinical benefit. Then it's going to be interesting, maybe after our first publication, to compare, the difference between Europe and USA. The LAAC score validation, now it's been done, but maybe in a more, larger basis. And then, the imaging has been very successful, like 5 publications with your registry. We will have a lot of information on imaging because the database is also dedicated for imaging, so we can analyze pre, peri, and post-procedural imaging. And of course, we will have a lot of information to compare different devices because here in Europe, we have more devices. We have Omega, we have Lambre, we have other devices. So we will have information that we can use, as compared to Europe. The other thing that maybe we should discuss at some point, I don't know, but I would like just to put it here, and we were discussing it before. I would add, the quality of life into these registries, but not as a Kansas City, that it's more, about functional status. This is like here probably useless. I would just more, I don't know, to create maybe a quality of life score based on, like the bleeding and, the fact of taking or not taking the anticoagulation. So, I mean, people that don't take the anticoagulants can go out. I mean, like the agenda is completely different. They can have activities. They don't have just to be dependent on the pill. So I think that should make sense, just to record that change of habit. And finally, I would like to ask you, and now you have the poll, the questionnaire, where I ask you, what you would like, and this is a ranking, this is not, one option. I would like just to see, in order, the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth. This is like random, but I think that it's just a summary of what you would like just to see published in this ELAACC. What do you think that is more important? So I don't know if we can activate or, yeah. So we're talking about the general manuscript, this first in Europe, maybe just to have like the largest registry in Europe. procedural data, talking more technical stuff, then, deep analysis of the DRT, PDL, and, the implication on outcomes, focus on imaging, because, here in Europe we have a lot of debate between CT, eyes, TOE, 2D, 3D, and something that is really contemporary, that's the antithrombotic strategies. So this is a ranking, okay. No, it's still, like just only 19 votes. Sorry, what happened? Well, okay, so 2 options only? Well, it doesn't work. Okay, so let's do it, the manual way. So, what, like coming from here, like just the first option, who thinks that, a general manuscript, the LAO in Europe, with a large, sample, it's the most important publication at this point of the ELAACC registry?
It actually works, but for option 1, we need to make 1 star, for option 2, 2 stars.
Okay, so let's go back. It's more complex. Well, the primitive way didn't work because nobody, raised the hand, so let's go back to this. Well, anyway, what it seems that, like the antithrombotic strategy, it's probably now the paper that people would like just to see. And the rest would be balanced.
So just, if you publish the first paper, just what the registry is, all subsequent papers will reference that paper, and it will, it just has a description of, and in your method section, you'll just say, the registry has been previously described in summary, and you have a paragraph, but you've described the registry, and it ends up improving the impact factor of the work in the registry, so that our original paper from 2020 is highly cited, just because everyone else ends up, anytime they make a reference to INCDR Registry, they reference that. So I would get that out.
So with any patient, no patients, just presenting the...
And the fact that you have devices that aren't available in other registries is helpful, just so, because people will then know what you have and what you're doing in terms of data collection and whatnot. And then just, I agree that you were talking a lot about funding as an important thing, and I think it's worth thinking about national funding sources and whatnot. The thing that really accelerated the publication out of the LAO registry is that our group at Yale, separate from ACC, we got permission from ACC to submit, and we got a $5 million grant from the NIH, and we published, most of those papers came out of that effort.
That's an important point, like also for publication, but also, for implementation. At this point, we need some help, because it's easy once you have it. Sometimes it can be not too easy just to implement, just the blueprint into the REDCap system. So that would be really much appreciated, just some funding in that sense.
And you want to pay data analysts. It'd be nice if you can have a stable of 2 or 3 data analysts that you can pay that stay with you for 5 years because you pay them well. And that's largely what our funding went towards, is our stable of our data analytic team that we've been able to retain. And you have a standard table 1 that's used in every one of your papers, and that makes it a lot easier. So I think the less you have turnover in terms of who's accessing the data and who's doing the publication, if you have a centralized publication committee and all that, it makes it much easier.
So I would like to ask you, like the question before, of course, like you are in another level. I mean, you are a giant and it's amazing, it's much better. I mean, audited, funded, everything. But what would you change, putting it in our skin, from the NCDR. I mean, if you can just make us a suggestion in that sense, just to be more information, just to be more precise, or just to be more broad. I mean, what do you recommend in the sense?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think we were slow getting publications out there, and so I think once you start that process and build enthusiasm, I think getting funding really accelerated things. So to the extent that you can do that, particularly to fund your analytic efforts, that'll be really valuable. I really I really think that some of the detail, it's always a tough balance of like more data, which is more to input and more work for all the sites versus less data, but being very strategic about what you add to the registry and being able to do so in a nimble fashion as new data comes out and as we start to worry about certain things more than we did in the past. And then also dumping old data fields. So look at your data collection form, and if there are things that you've not published on, get rid of it to make it easier for sites, and we've done that as well. So I think trying to be nimble with the registry is the other thing I would recommend. And then thinking about collaborations worldwide, which is of course why I'm here. Thank you, Philippe, and everyone for having me.
Thank you very much, Xavi, and Jim, and all. So to close this session about data and clinical trials, I would like to go a few minutes with you about this question of the Academic Research Consortium initiative. First of all, thank you so much for those in this room who participated to this first effort. It's been a long journey, like 2 or 3 years, 2 physical meetings, one in Washington, one in Paris, and many discussions, remote and votes and discussion. That's the beauty of collaborative work. And we finally get some consensus, some definitions and endpoints that clearly updated the Munich assessment that we had from 10 years ago, and it will be published very soon in the European Heart Journal. So thank you so much for that. That was a great journey again, and sometimes it's tough. I mean, it's the beauty of collaborative work, and we know in this room, some of people, they know that we had some tough discussion for certain points, but I mean, it's very important for us to align on what is really important in clinical trials. And thank you again to the companies that helped doing this effort. So what should be done in new initiative? I mean, should we stay on this one for 20 years, or should we go further? Should we go beyond? I think we definitely need to go beyond. We covered with this one procedure, definitions and endpoints on mortality, neurological events, systemic embolism, bleeding. Cardiac imaging definitions were updated, antithrombotic treatment, about the intensity and the duration. We went through the composite endpoints and the trial design principle that were covered with this first initiative. And then we talk about patient profiles today. And this has not been covered with this first initiative. I definitely think we need better patient characterization. We need to balance the ischemic and bleeding risk in patients. And we all know there's some overlap between factors leading to higher or increased ischemic and bleeding risk. We have all these old patients with renal failure, with suboptimal procedure results, and what about the post-procedure treatment? Everything leads to higher thrombotic and higher bleeding risk, so we definitely need to better define this population. For those in this room who are interventional cardiologists, you probably know that we had a first effort to define high bleeding risk patients. It was in the PCI population, and it was in 2019. And this was the first effort to define these patients that are at high bleeding risk. And you can see here that we had some patient-related, procedure-related characteristics about this high bleeding risk. And this was at the origin of a lot of publications that have been really highlighted in the past 10 years, on focusing on this population that was completely outside the focus before, because they were excluded from clinical trials, and we didn't know anything about these patients, but they are the critical patients. And logically, we try to apply this criteria, PCI patient-specific, to a TAVR population. And we found that these criteria do not adapt to these TAVR patients because they are not the same patients, they are much older, it's not the same procedure, we have much bigger sheath for this procedure. So we were not surprised to see that these PCI specific criteria were not working for this TAVR population. So that's why we did another definition with the Academic Research Consortium behind us, and we defined these criteria that were really TAVI specific. And you see that we have now the validation of this in large registries coming from North America and coming from Europe in a broad population, some of them having some oral anticoagulants, and some of them representing high-risk, very high-risk patients. So what about the left atrial appendage closure procedure? I think we have to test these high bleeding risk criteria, but I would not be surprised that it's not working and that we need to define this new population, and that could be part of the next initiative. What about concomitant procedure? We just say that we have more and more concomitant procedures, especially in the US. But then, what if both an ablation or another procedure like mitral clip or other procedure and the LAAC are performed at the same time? So what is your guidance on how to assign device complications to two devices, to one procedure, which one? So we have to better define that. I mean, if you have a pericardial effusion and you have done an ablation and you have done a LAAC closure in the same procedure, how would you declare this pericardial effusion? This is something that should be clearly discussed in the next document. Let's go back to strokes. I mean, it's something, we defined strokes by the LAARC definition that we slightly modified, but we didn't want to change that because the LAARC has been defined by neurologists, and we really think they are the good specialists to define this. But at the end, when we think about grouping hemorrhagic and ischemic stroke, and especially for this left atrial appendage closure procedure, you can obscure some opposite effects and harm or lack of benefit by canceling each other, you know? So if you have an hemorrhagic stroke and if you have an ischemic stroke, and if you think about non-inferiority, you get neutral. But it's not neutral because it's not the same to have an hemorrhagic or to have an ischemic stroke, because hemorrhagic stroke are usually, as we all know, much more serious. So we have to think about that. Usually we have all strokes included in the definitions, and all strokes is not really fair. We talked about some, and we will talk about trials in the next session. And I think you all agree that it's not the same to have a large bleeding, intracranial bleeding, and to have a very small ischemic stroke without sequelae. So it's not the same, and it's quite bizarre to group all these events. I think we have to continue to promote sex-specific outcomes. I mean, there's underrepresentation of women in clinical trials. We have seen from your slides, Jim, that women are 42% of the procedures in the INCDR registries, and they represent maximum 30 to 31% of the patients in clinical trials. So we have to have an effort altogether to increase female representation in trials, because females have characteristics that are associated with more major bleeding, vascular complication, more pericardial effusion, and we want research to be driven by this specific aspect. And then that's another one. I think since years we can see that everyone said, okay, we need to ask the patients their opinion, because everything we are doing here is for the patients. I think we all agree about that. And the regulators really strongly support that we get some opinion of the patients for designing clinical trials Because, yeah, okay, now the primary endpoint is usually like efficacy, death, stroke, systemic embolism, but we don't really know if it's really something that is the most important for the patients. And I'm sure in this room, if you have some patient in the consultation, you will ask them what they really want for the future. And what they really want, as Xavier said, is I want to live, yes, but I want a good quality of life. What I don't want is to stay in a wheeling chair and be like, a problem for my family for 10 years. So they say, okay, yes, survival is definitely something important, but survival how? And this is not covered by the definition that we have at the moment. And I think we should make really an effort to ask to patients association and to go through, what they think about bleeding concerns. If you have a bleed and a bleed and a bleed, and if you are going to the hospital every time, I think for them, I'm sure it's much, much, much more inconvenient than having a TIA, and then it's okay. And we usually perceive as physicians and as people working in this field that a bleed is not so important. You just give some blood and that's it. No. I strongly disagree. We don't see these patients when they bleed, but they are going in the ER, they are going in the intensive care units, and finally they have a much, much, much worse prognosis compared to patients without bleeding. So I think we should take this really into account. We have some statistical distortion. I mentioned the fact of hemorrhagic and ischemic bleeding, but I think it's really important to think about this. It's about the fact that non-inferiority trials are sensitive to even dilution. And we should not dilute events quality and severity by adding all these events in the composite endpoints. I think it's really important to continue to be as clear as possible. We will discuss in the next session about champion AF, about closure AF, and I think this is really some points to take into account. What about how to analyze the population? You know that efficacy is usually analyzed by intention to treat, and safety should be, or must be, I would say, analyzed as a per protocol analysis, because they are driven by what has actually exposed the patient to a drug or to a device. So bleeding, did you get the bleeding? Yeah. Did you get a procedure? Yes or no? I mean, this is something, if you use the safety outcome as per protocol analysis, I think it would be less subject to discussion, and this is something that has been discussed, especially recently with the Champion AF trial. So I hope, it's a clear attempt to have you for the second initiative, both experts and industry, to have you supporting us. We need to continue to better define and to better, I would say, clarify about the definitions and endpoints in clinical trials. It's an endless story. We will continue to have new data, and we will try to get this done. I'm not sure that everything that I presented is okay, and there are probably additional very interesting things to discuss. So if you have suggestions, please take the microphone and let me know. Jim, other people, what do you think? You have been so important, so crucial for the left atrial appendage academic research consortium document.
Can we put the list back up? I think, I agree. I would agree with the prioritization that you put in place around kind of what we should be prioritizing next. And I agree with you. It's really interesting, your comments with regards to bleeding. Just, I did a bunch of early, in my career, did a lot of cost effectiveness work where we use quality of life data for that. And bleeding we really discounted as a, a few day phenomenon that didn't generally result in mortality. And I think I've really come to see with this patient population that that's not true for everyone. There are certain people for whom they have a single bleed and that's that, but many of these patients are really impacted by incessant bleeding events and whatnot. And so I couldn't agree more. I'm thinking that maybe a collaboration with John Spurtis, it's worth, John Spurtis has done a lot of work around development of scoring and quality of life, developed the AFEQT score for AF ablation, and I'll bring it up. I'm collaborating with John on a DRT project right now and can raise it with him around bleeding risk and quality of life. So, but I would agree. I think bleeding risk and thinking about how to, these net benefit endpoints are, I think we need to be thinking about. It was one of the challenges, we'll talk about closure, where it was a combined endpoint, and it's really hard to know what to do with those combined endpoints. So thinking about how to parse that out and then think about net clinical benefit is really a worthwhile endeavor as we move forward.
Okay, thank you very much. So maybe it's time to go to the next session.